Sometimes the most astonishing events in life evade all rational explanation, leaving the question, is it coincidence or is it fate? Eerie parallels, inexplicable alignments, and strange coincidences have left us wondering about synchronicity and destiny. The Great Pyramids of Giza have been a source of bafflement for centuries as we struggle to understand how an ancient civilization was able to build such massive structures to such precise specifications. The rulers of Egypt at the time, known as the pharaohs, believed that they were direct descendants from the sun god Ra, and in tribute to him had the pyramids built so that their corners, along with the Orion constellation, point to Ra's temple, which is located at Heliopolis. The work that was done to build these massive structures took many years to complete. Each of the massive bricks used in their construction weighs around 2.5 tons, and considering that as many as 2.3 million of these bricks were used, it baffles the mind to think that they did so without the use of any technology or machinery. History books often teach us that the slaves who were responsible for most of the labor were treated badly and starved. But the reality is that they were well paid for their work, since a starving laborer wouldn't be much use while constructing such huge structures. It's a strange fact to consider, but the three pyramids at the Giza necropolis, the Great Pyramid, the Pyramid of Khafra, and the Pyramid of Menkora, have all shrunk over the years. This is thanks to wind and rain erosion, as well as the fact that looters have stripped away some of the material, which may then either be sold or used elsewhere. It's also believed that the granite tomb inside the Great Pyramid existed there first, and that the pyramid was then built around it. Scholars came to this conclusion when they realized that the tomb couldn't fit through the narrow passageways of the pyramid's interior, and hence it must have been placed at the site before the pyramid was constructed. Not many people are aware that the pyramids were almost destroyed in the 12th century, and if that plot had been successful, we likely would never have had the chance to see them. At the time, Al-Aziz, the second Sultan of Egypt, attempted to bring the structures down, but was unsuccessful when his men could only manage to cause surface damage, and the plan was abandoned. We are familiar with the pyramids' sandy, dull color, but they didn't always have this appearance. After they were constructed, they were painted in different vibrant colors, as is evidenced by yellow, red, and blue pigment that's been found on some of the bricks through the years. All of these facts about the pyramids have fascinated us for many years, but there's one fact that still mystifies scholars and scientists, since we don't know whether it's merely a coincidence or if it was intentionally done. We know that these buildings were constructed with some of our celestial bodies in mind, but the site where they're located was also seemingly painstakingly chosen, since the pyramid's latitude perfectly coincides with the speed of light. In a vacuum, light travels at 299,792,458 meters per second, and quite remarkably, the Great Pyramid of Giza was built at latitude 29.9792458 north, which is, if not a coincidence, a feat that should not have been possible at that time. Most people believe it to be a happy accident, since the ancient Egyptians would not have measured in meters, a measurement that was only defined in 1791 CE. Though some conspiracy theorists are adamant that this coincidence holds some kind of deeper meaning that we simply don't understand. Identity theft is a very serious crime that affects thousands of people around the world every year. If a criminal is able to steal someone's identity, they can cause an untold amount of damage to their finances or reputation. It's no surprise then that when a woman named Patricia Ann Campbell found out that someone had used her social security number, she became alarmed and immediately tried to get to the bottom of it. Upon investigating the case, it was found that a clerical error had been made 40 years earlier when Patricia was born, and she was asked to go to the Social Security Administration office to rectify the mistake. She was surprised to find another woman also waiting there with the same complaint. As it turns out, both women were named Patricia Ann Campbell, but their similarities didn't end there. Once the women started comparing notes, they were astonished to learn that despite having different parents, they each had a father named Robert Campbell. They were both born on the 13th of March, 1941. Both got married in the year 1959 to men who were serving in the military, They each had 2 children of the same ages, 19 and 21. Both women had studied cosmetics in the past. Both were artists who mainly painted in oil, and both had jobs as bookkeepers at some point in their lives. The 2 Patricias had never met, and yet they lived such similar lives, leading many people to believe that this was no coincidence. In a similar case, 2 women from South Korea found themselves in a confusing situation after immigrating to the US. They were both named Jeon Kim, though one lived in Los Angeles while the other lived in Evanston, Illinois. When the 2 women were suspected of being identity thieves, their bank accounts were shut down and their credit cards were locked, leaving them with no way to access their money. This came after one of the Kims tried to open a Chase bank account, but was told that her social security number had already been in use to open an account, and staff at the bank became suspicious. Once the mistake was identified, the 2 women attempted to have it rectified, but they were caught up in a massive amount of red tape, since the SSA refused to admit that it had been a mistake. One of the Jeon Kims was told that such mistakes sometimes occur with Asian people, since they have very similar names, and yet when she applied for a new social security number, she was given the same one again. She was then told that the SSA's computer system was unable to tell the 2 women apart, and hence there were massive issues with her green card application. She was told that if she made a fuss about the social security numbers, her application would be set back by up to 3 years, a process that usually takes just 6 months to complete. Several news agencies picked up on this story and attempted to get to the root of the problem, but they received no reply from the SSA offices. Eventually, the SSA stated that the Kim who lived in LA could keep her social security number, and the Kim who lived in Illinois would be issued a new one. Jackie Chan is one of the most famous martial artists of all time, as well as a household name when it comes to blockbuster movies. But he's also the subject of what many people believe to be a stunning coincidence that saved his life amidst one of America's darkest days. Chan is known to perform all of his stunts when filming a movie, but this has, on occasion, caused him some problems. When filming a movie called Armor of God, one scene called for him to jump from a window into a tree, but he was unhappy with the first take. He decided to make another attempt, but the stunt went wrong and he completely missed the tree and fell almost 40 feet onto the ground below, resulting in a fracture to his skull. Fortunately, he made a full recovery after undergoing emergency surgery. Not everyone is aware of the fact that he's also a very good singer who trained in opera. Not only has he provided the singing voices in Chinese dubs of some Disney movies, but he also has released several studio albums and a few compilation albums during his career. Furthermore, his name isn't really Jackie Chan. It's a moniker that was given to him while he had a job as a construction worker in Canberra, Australia, and in reality, his birth name is Chan Kong Sang. The Rush Hour movies are some of his most iconic, but Chan has often stated that he doesn't enjoy them. He was unimpressed by the action scenes in the movies and didn't fully understand the American humor that they contained. But he adds that he completed the movies without complaints, since he was being paid a lot of money to appear in them. He's also worked with another famous martial arts actor, Bruce Lee, on 2 different occasions. He worked as a stuntman on Enter the Dragon and Fists of Fury while using the name Chen Yunlong. He eventually struggled to get himself insured after suffering several injuries while performing stunts. These include a dislocated shoulder, broken nose, lacerated hip, broken teeth, lacerated hip again, and several others, which resulted in him creating his own stunt team, which he named Sin Kar Pan. He's never portrayed a villain on screen, and his character in a film called Nosebleed would have been no different, but that film was never made thanks to an uncanny coincidence that happened on the day that filming was supposed to begin. Chen came up with the idea for the martial arts comedy back in 1999, and the plot was meant to revolve around a window washer, played by Chan, who worked at the World Trade Center. While doing his duties, he would have become aware of a terrorist plot to destroy the Statue of Liberty, or according to some sources, the World Trade Center. On the 11th of September 2001, Chan was supposed to start filming at the Twin Towers, but at the last minute, filming was called off since the script had not been delivered on time. The crew left the area, and later that morning, the tragic attacks on the World Trade Center occurred. Chan has since stated that he believes he would have perished that day had the script been on time, but thanks to an uncanny coincidence, he was already well out of the area before the attacks took place. In December of 2023, an event occurred on Elm Ridge Road in the town of Philadelphia in New York that left investigators baffled. What seemed like just another traffic accident turned out to be a rather complicated case when it was discovered that the two drivers of the vehicles knew each other. On the 12th of December that year, a pickup truck and an SUV collided head-on, and officers rushed to the scene once they were notified of the accident. Each of the drivers had sustained injuries, and they were taken to Upstate University Hospital in Syracuse to receive treatment. It wasn't until later that they were identified by their respective driver's licenses, and investigators were amazed to find that the cars belonged to 43-year-old Nikki Stone and his 43-year-old wife, Linda Stone. Linda was left in critical condition, while Nikki's injuries were less serious, but he still had to be intubated, and hence investigators are unable to speak to the couple to find out exactly how the crash occurred. They knew that the couple lived in the town of Antwerp, and their house was located on County Route 194, but they couldn't figure out why they were driving in opposite directions on Elm Ridge Road, how fast each of the vehicles were traveling, or how they ended up crashing into each other. In the days that followed, Linda started showing signs of improvement, and her condition was upgraded from critical to stable. Nikki was eventually also declared to be in critical condition, but eventually some progress was made in the investigation. A few days after the incident took place, both Nikki and Linda were charged over the accident when it became apparent that they'd behaved recklessly. Nikki was found to have had an alcohol blood level of 0.22, almost 3 times over the legal limit. Linda's tests were only marginally better, as she was found to have had an alcohol level of 0.19, when the acceptable level is 0.08. It was also asserted that both drivers had failed to keep right and that they were traveling at excessive speeds. As a result, they were charged with first-degree vehicular assault and aggravated driving while intoxicated, a misdemeanor offense. Nikki faced an additional charge for failing to wear a seatbelt. Photos of the cars at the impound lot after the crash showed the extent of the damage caused, and it's apparent that both vehicles must have been traveling well above the speed limit when they collided. Investigators were asked where the couple was traveling from when they collided, but this information has not been made public for reasons unknown, likely because the investigation was still active at the time. It was later discovered that Nikki worked as a correctional officer for the Governor Correctional Facility in St. Lawrence County, and following the incident, he was placed on leave. Linda previously worked as an office assistant at the Cape Vincent Correctional Facility, but she stopped working there sometime in 2022. Nikki and Linda don't have a history of domestic violence, and it's been determined that the accident was not intentional, as many people believed at the time. After recovering from their injuries, they were arraigned on the 6th of January 2024, and both were later released. Sometimes a coincidence can save a life in the most improbable of ways. One good example of this occurred in Japan when an 80-year-old man named Zhu Weifeng heard someone in distress outside of his house. When he went to investigate, he was shocked to realize that a young boy had fallen into the river near his house, and he immediately sprang into action. The boy had been playing near the river with his grandmother watching from nearby, but he had slipped and ended up in the water, unable to swim to safety. Zhu, who was still recovering from an injury that he'd suffered from a fall down a flight of stairs, managed to lower himself into the water before making his way over to the boy and helping him back to shore. The boy was taken to a local hospital where he received treatment, and later that day he was released. The boy and his grandmother were later stunned to learn that that same man had saved the boy's father from drowning in that exact same river 30 years earlier. A similar incident occurred years later when a 4-year-old boy named Roger Lozier was spending time on the beach with his family. He'd been building sandcastles for most of the morning, but eventually he decided that he wanted to take a closer look at the ocean. He wandered away unnoticed and entered the water, something that every parent dreads. Before long, he was caught in a current and was dragged further away from the shore with no way of getting back. Luckily, a woman called Alice Blaze happened to be looking at the right spot, and she realized that Roger was in trouble. She raced into the water and managed to scoop him out of the water in time before delivering him safely to his family. If it weren't for the fact that Alice happened to look in his direction, he would likely have perished in the waves. but he was given a second chance at life thanks to a complete stranger. 9 years later, when Roger was 13, he'd taken a keen interest in swimming, and one day he was on an inflatable raft, tracking a school of fish, when he got the chance to repay Alice's kindness by saving a stranger's life. He heard a woman on the shore screaming that her husband was in the water and that he was in trouble. Roger immediately knew what to do. He steered his inflatable raft towards the man and managed to grab a hold of him. Unfortunately, there wasn't enough room to lift the man onto the raft, so he held on to him, keeping his head above the water until help arrived and he could be taken back to the shore. He traveled to the hospital where the man was receiving treatment, and there the woman thanked him for saving her husband's life. A presentation was held to honor Roger for his life-saving deed, and it was here that he learned that the man who he had saved was named Bob Blaze. In a stunning coincidence, Bob was married to Alice, the same woman who'd saved Roger from drowning 9 years earlier. These two incidents occurred on the same beach 9 years apart in what many people believe to either be a stunning coincidence or an incredible example of karma. During the 17th century, a man named Sir Edmund Barry Godfrey was seen as somewhat of an odd character. He was the 11th child of a wealthy family that lived in Kent, England, and he served as a civil servant amidst the outbreak of the Great Plague. While many others in the same position abandoned their post out of fear that they would also become ill, Edmund stayed at his post as ordered, and for this he received knighthood. But his friends and family found it strange that he would occasionally spend time with people of the Catholic faith when he himself was Anglican. He had no qualms about spending time with the working class, something that was very uncommon amongst the wealthy at the time. Due to this, he was accused of creating a rebellion against Charles II, but these charges were later dropped thanks to a lack of evidence. But he did later spend time in jail after having the king's personal physician arrested for not repaying the debts that he owed Godfrey. To this day, many people believe that he really was involved in plots against Charles II, but this remains mere speculation. But what is certain is that Godfrey's reputation took a serious hit when Sir Joseph Williamson, the Secretary of State at the time, received reports from the Lieutenant of the Tower of London that Godfrey was an anti-Catholic agitator. He was said to be part of a group called the Peyton Gang, and that he was in league with Sir Robert Peyton, who wanted nothing more than to dethrone Charles II. Nothing could be done about this, since no proof existed, but needless to say, Godfrey's reputation with politicians at the time was tarnished by these rumors. At the time, the priest, Titus Oates, invented a fictional conspiracy theory, claiming that a plot had been devised to have Charles II assassinated in a bid to reintroduce the Catholic faith to England. The aim of this fake conspiracy theory was to create an air of anti-Catholicism in the country, but to do so, he needed someone to back up the bogus proof that he had invented. To do this, he turned to Godfrey. But one of the people who would be implicated was the Catholic courtier Edward Coleman, who happened to be a close friend of Godfrey's. It's believed that Godfrey warned Coleman ahead of time, but he was found guilty anyway and was eventually executed. That's when Godfrey's life came to an unfortunate end. A few days after Coleman was executed, Godfrey was found deceased face down in a ditch. There were no signs of a struggle, but he'd clearly been badly assaulted, and he'd been stabbed with his own sword after he was already deceased. Robbery was ruled out as a motive, since he still had a lot of money on him when he was discovered, and none of his valuables had been stolen. Oates saw this as an opportunity, and he accused Miles Prance, a Catholic, of being the perpetrator. Prance likely wasn't involved, but one of his tenants, who owed Prance a lot of money, came forward to corroborate the accusations, and Prance was arrested. He was eventually forced to confess, but stated that he wasn't actually the one who committed the crime, since he'd hired 3 men to do the dirty work. He chose to implicate 3 men, Robert Greene, Henry Barry, and Lawrence Hill, who had very little money and hence could not afford legal advice. This meant they stood virtually no chance when their day in court arrived, and unsurprisingly they were found guilty. After the 3 were sentenced to be executed, Prance recanted his confession, but then went back on this decision, stating that he was indeed guilty. This happened a few times, and eventually his guilt was merely assumed. This is when an incredible coincidence took place. The 3 men, with the last names Greene, Barry, and Hill, were executed by hanging on the 5th of February, 1679. But what made this event so strange is that their lives were ended on Greenberry Hill. Murder is the most heinous of crimes, but sadly it's one that's committed all over the world on a daily basis. Some murder mysteries are centuries old and have never been solved, while in other cases, the crime is solved within minutes of it being committed. These types of cases usually follow a similar narrative. Someone reports that a person's life has been ended, an investigation is launched, and a suspect is identified. It then usually takes some time for the culprit to be tracked down, and eventually they're sent to prison to pay for their crime. The scenario has played out millions of times throughout history, but now and then a murder case comes along that seems to defy all the odds. The cases involving Barbara Forrest and Mary Ashford are truly strange due to the many coincidences that were found after their lives were cut short. On the 27th of May, 1817, a man named George Jackson was walking near a flooded pit in Birmingham, England, when he noticed something strange lying on the ground. When he investigated, he realized that the items were women's shoes, a hat, and other items of clothing. He immediately reported what he had found, and when the pit was searched by local residents, they were dismayed to find 20-year-old Mary Ashford deceased in the water. The surrounding area was searched, and footprints belonging to a man and a woman were found in a field not far from the pit. It was later revealed that Mary had walked to work from Langley Heath to Birmingham the previous day, but she stopped off at a friend Hannah Cox's house, where she then left some clothing that she planned to wear to a dance later that night. She returned to the house at 6 p.m. and changed into the dress for the dance. Mary and Hannah left for the dance, and at midnight left with two men, Benjamin Carter and Abraham Thornton. Hannah eventually left for home, but Mary and Thornton continued to work together. At 4 a.m., Mary went back to Hannah's house, where she changed her clothes once more. She was last seen walking home just after 4 a.m., and the next day she was found deceased. Thornton was eventually cleared of suspicion, but the case seemed to repeat itself 157 years later. On May 27, 1974, 20-year-old Barbara Forrest was found deceased in a field in Erdington. She'd gone missing after spending a night out dancing with her boyfriend, Simon Belcher, and he too was cleared of all suspicion. A suspect, Michael Ian Thornton, was arrested after biological material was found on his clothing, and he was found to be lying about his alibi for that night, but he was set free due to a lack of evidence. But the two crimes contained some eerie coincidences. They took place on the same date, 157 years apart. Both women were 20 years old, and they were both born on the same day. Both Mary and Barbara spent their last night out dancing and lost their lives on Whit Monday, the day of the Holy Spirit. They were both discovered in the same area just 300 yards from their respective sites. In both cases, a man with the last name Thornton was apprehended and charged, but then cleared as there wasn't enough evidence to convict him. Both these cases remain unsolved, and it's likely that we'll never learn who was responsible for these two heinous crimes. When someone passes away in a country other than their own, it can often be difficult and expensive for their remains to be brought back home, and in many cases, their family decides to have them buried in the country where they lost their lives instead. This was the case in the strange case of Charles Francis Collin, a stage actor who rose to fame during the 1870s. Charles was born on Prince Edward Island in Canada in 1842. His parents were Irish immigrants who struggled to get by, and so he was taken in by his wealthy aunt who lived in London. She believed Charles would make a good lawyer one day, and she paid for his study in this direction. But shortly after turning 15, he revealed to her that he had no interest in studying law, and that instead he wanted to become an actor. This enraged her, so she told him that he could either study law with her blessing or pursue a career as an actor without her financial assistance. When he turned 17, he made his choice and became a member of the Sadler's Wells Theatre, which is located in Islington, London. In 1876, he decided to travel to America to further his career, and before long he was appearing in plays on Broadway. His career quickly took off, and soon he received offers to play many other roles. For the next 25 years, he enjoyed his time in the spotlight, and one of his most memorable performances was when he played the lead character in The Royal Box, a play that he had written himself. He made one last appearance on stage on the 28th of October, 1899, after which he spent his time writing plays and finding actors to play the characters that he'd created. But there was one thing that bothered him throughout his 25-year-long career. Before becoming an actor, Charles had visited a fortune teller who told him that he would become a renowned actor, but that he would pass away when he reached the highest point of his career. She added that his spirit would remain restless unless his remains were brought back to the place where he was born. Charles wasn't the type of man who believed in superstitious predictions, but for some reason he never forgot the fortune teller's words, and before long he became concerned that she'd spoken the truth. He wrote a letter to his family instructing them to bury him on Prince Edward Island after he passed away, thereby hopefully ensuring that the spirit would find peace after his time was up. In October of 1899, he traveled to Galveston, Texas to present one of his new plays called Bridge of Luck. But soon after arriving, he fell ill. Doctors were called, but they were unable to figure out what was wrong with him, and in the days that followed, his condition only worsened. He eventually passed away on the 27th of November that year, and he was buried in a temporary grave in Galveston until his family could have him moved back to Canada. But this never happened, since his parents were deceased and his sister lived in England. Charles seemed fated to remain in America, but the following year, a hurricane hit Texas, and the cemetery where he was buried was flooded. His crypt collapsed, and his coffin ended up missing. It soon became apparent that the coffin had been swept out to sea, and despite searches being conducted, it could not be located. That is, until 1907, when Charles's coffin washed up on the coast of Prince Edward Island. The lottery is something that could change anyone's life in a mere instant. The amounts of money that could be won are at times staggering, but in order to stand even the smallest of chances at winning, a ticket needs to be purchased first. Some people claim to have certain tactics when playing the lottery, such as choosing only certain numbers that are drawn often, or never using the numbers in their own birthdays. But in reality, it's a thing of chance that can't be predicted. This is evidenced by a strange lottery draw that took place in South Africa in December of 2020. During the Powerball lottery draw, people were amazed at the fact that the numbers 5, 6, 7, 8, and 9 were drawn, followed by the Powerball number 10. Understandably, this gave rise to several conspiracy theories, since 20 people had played those exact numbers, and each won around $370,000. Something that was seen as completely absurd, since choosing that sequence of numbers further reduces one's odds of winning, supposedly. The country's National Lotteries Commission conducted a full review of the draw, and in the end it was found to be purely coincidental, and each of the winners was allowed to keep their money. But this was only one of the many strange instances when it comes to lottery draws. One very strange and unfortunate event unfolded in 1980, when a 61-year-old woman named Maureen Wilcox bought lottery tickets for both the Rhode Island and Massachusetts draws at the same time. She was more than elated when she checked the numbers the next day and found that she'd inexplicably chosen the numbers that came up in each of these draws, but her joy was unfortunately short-lived. She soon realized that her ticket for the Massachusetts draw contained the correct numbers for the Rhode Island lottery, and vice versa. Neither of the tickets paid out any money, and she could only marvel at the improbability of the event. The chances of this happening are even lower than winning the lottery outright, and it seemed as though she was the unfortunate victim of coincidence and circumstance. It's believed that this is the only incidence of this unbelievable coincidence happening in the history of American lotteries. Martin de Jonge is a former Dutch cyclist who enjoyed a successful career that spanned 16 years from 2004 to 2020. But he's also known for an uncanny set of coincidences that by all accounts ended up saving his life twice. On the 17th of July, 2014, Martin was planning on traveling from Amsterdam to Kuala Lumpur, and he booked an airline ticket for a flight that most of us are now familiar with, Malaysia Airlines Flight MH17. The flight was supposed to take around 11.5 hours, but it never arrived at its destination, as it flew over a part of the Ukraine where Russian separatists were embroiled in a bitter conflict and where combat was being actively fought. As the plane approached the Russian border, all seemed as it should be, but suddenly all communication from the plane stopped. Shortly after that, it disappeared from traffic control radar, and eventually it was discovered to have crashed. It was later discovered that the plane had been deliberately shot down by Russian soldiers who were following the orders of their superiors. Fortunately, Martin had spotted a different flight that was much cheaper than the one he had booked, and at the last minute, he changed his ticket and was not aboard the ill-fated flight. He had narrowly escaped with his life, but unbelievably, it wasn't the first time. On the 8th of March 2014, just 4 months earlier, he was supposed to be on another doomed plane, Malaysian Airlines Flight 370. The flight was supposed to travel from Kuala Lumpur to Beijing, but at 1:07 a.m. that morning, the plane's aircraft communication addressing and reporting system stopped transmitting data. The flight was last seen on radar at 8:11 a.m., after which it was lost completely. Searches were conducted in the South China Sea, where it was thought to have crashed into the water, but for a long time nothing was found. Pieces of debris were eventually recovered, but the bulk of the plane remains missing to this day, giving rise to several conspiracy theories as to what happened during the flight and what caused it to crash so far from its intended route. Before the flight took off, Martin and several other cyclists were due to travel to Taiwan to participate in the Tour de Taiwan race. The logical choice would have been to book tickets on Malaysian Airlines Flight 370, but this would have meant that they would have to endure a long layover, and luckily they started looking at alternatives. They eventually decided to take a flight that took off 30 minutes later than Flight 370, and later they were dismayed to learn that their original flight had gone missing in the ocean. It may have been mere coincidence, but 2 last-minute decisions saved Martin's life twice in the span of just 4 months. Before the Chicago Cubs were born, the Chicago White Stockings rose in 1876. It was one of 8 inaugural teams. It was this team that would go on to win the first National League championship and become one of the first dynasties after winning 6 of the 11 championship titles. The modern Cubs rose in 1903 and carried on the success of their predecessors, posting a record in wins in 1906, where they had won 116 games. This win would be their first pennant win as the Cubs. In 1907, following a repeat pennant, they would win the first World Series title. The year after that, they would win another World Series and became the first baseball team to win back-to-back World Series titles. This wasn't the end of their success either. The Cubs captured pennants in 1910 and 1918, and another 4 in the span of 10 years. They would play in the World Series during these years, but this stroke of luck would meet a daunting end in 1945 when the Cubs faced the Detroit Tigers. It wasn't the Tigers, though, who ended their winning streak, but rather a fan in the crowd. The successful team's doom would begin with William Sionis, a local who owned a saloon called Billy Goat Tavern. On that day, October 6th, Sionis purchased 2 tickets to Game 4. The Cubs needed to win only another 2 of the games in the World Series after having already beaten the Tigers 2-1. Sionis arrived at Wrigley Field, and with him was his pet goat named Murphy. At the entrance, though, Sionis was barred from entering the park since no animals were permitted inside. Frustrated, the saloon owner spoke with the owner of the Cubs, P.K. Wrigley. Wrigley allowed Sionis in, but the goat had to stay out. It was an outrage, leading to the man and his goat both being upset. It was right then and there that Sionis exclaimed that the Cubs would never win another World Series so long as Murphy was not permitted in Wrigley Field. From that moment on, the Cubs were cursed. The first coincidence came later that day during Game 4, when the Cubs lost to the Tigers, their first defeat in years. It was as though the curse bestowed upon them by the Billy Goat owner had already swept across the field. Strangely, the Cubs would lose the rest of the games too, sweeping them from the World Series. From there, the Cubs found themselves stuck in an irreversible pattern of losing. Wait till next year became their motto, and winning the World Series from that point on became a dream. From 1945, the Chicago team would have no pennants and no World Series appearances. It was a complete reversal of their good fortune. In 1969, over 20 years later, Sionis claimed to have lifted his alleged curse. That year, the Cubs began winning and maintained their first-place position until mid-August, when the Miracle Mets overtook them. On October 22nd in 1970, Sionis passed away, and hopes ignited that the curse would only now be lifted. But the Cubs' failing pattern continued, and all attempts to rectify the losing streak proved futile. In 1973, in an effort to lift the curse of the billy goat, the nephew of the former tavern owner, Sam Sionis, decided to take a goat to the field, escorting him there via a white limousine and a red carpet entrance to the park. They even held a sign saying, "All is forgiven, let me lead the Cubs to the pennant." Murphy by this time was long gone, and so the goat in place of him was his very own descendant named Socrates. Socrates and his handler made it through to the entrance, but once they arrived at the gates, they were shockingly denied entrance once more. And just like that, the Cubs saw their mid-season first place wither away and draw in yet another unsuccessful season. In 1984, in another attempt to lift the curse, the Tribune Company, the new owners of the Cubs, invited Socrates back to the field. Finally, Sam Sionis and his goat were allowed on the grass. With the raise of a hat, Sam exclaimed that the curse had been lifted. Lo and behold, the Cubs began winning once more. They managed to win their way into the first postseason game and division title in 40 years. The streak pressed on and took the first 2 games of the National League Championship Series. All they needed to do was win one of the next 3 games in the set before they could reach the World Series. Sam and Socrates waited for a call that allowed them to go with the team to these games. This would ensure the victory of the Cubs, but they left him and the goat behind in Chicago, and the losing began again. In 1989, hoping for a repeat of 1984, the organizers allowed the goat and his handler back on the field, and again the Cubs won. But it appeared that no one was learning the rules of the curse, and they again left Socrates behind, and again the Chicago team began losing. This pattern repeated itself multiple times. The goat was led onto the field, the Cubs would win, but when the goat was left behind, the Cubs would lose. It wasn't until 2016 that the curse would actually finally be broken, and the team would restore their winning streak. It was that year that Sam was allowed to get his hands on Murphy's old bell, which he'd worn to the World Series, that started the curse. Sam rang the bell, and it seemed to have awakened the spirits, allowing the team to win and continue winning. The Cubs would also win their first pennant since the curse. The date, October 22nd. October 22nd, the 46th anniversary of William Sionis' passing. These weren't the only coincidences involving the Cubs or the name Murphy. Murphy the Goat wasn't the only one who impacted the team's fortune and success. It turned out that the owner of the Cubs, the last time they won the World Series back in 1908, was named Charles Murphy. In 1969, the Mets' general manager was a man named Johnny Murphy, and their announcer was Bob Murphy. The field where the 1984 National League Championship Series was held was the Jack Murphy Stadium, and the MVP of the series was a man named Daniel Murphy, who finished the series batting .529 with 4 home runs. Espionage was a common occurrence during the Second World War. There are many stories referring to the topic that have traveled throughout history, but one of the best-known instances of espionage was that of the Red Orchestra. The Red Orchestra was a German resistance group that fought against the fascists. The organization was made up of hundreds of German members from various backgrounds and belief systems. Aside from discussing political issues, helping victims of persecution, and documenting war crimes, this organization was also responsible for passing military intelligence to the Soviet Union. Once German officials got word of the organization, they sought to hunt them down and arrest the members of the Red Orchestra, the group that had become spies for the Soviet Union. Prior to the invasion of the USSR, the group had made use of couriers to get information to Moscow, but the mounting pressures of the war forced them to use radios instead. The members of the clandestine operation were now radio operators spying on Germany under dictatorship. In an effort to rid Germany of this group once and for all, an operation was put together in November of 1941. The project saw Officer Henry Pipe headed to Brussels, Belgium, with a team of specialists dedicated to tracking down the Red Orchestra. Pipe and his team arrived in Brussels and began setting up fake import and export businesses. This would give them the cover as they carried out their operations to search for the clandestine organization. The business was established alongside a real import-export business known as Semexco. Pipe had been inquiring about Semexco and was told by local Germans that it was a good company. It had helped them acquire materials to aid the war effort. They were non-threatening and engaged in some very non-threatening activities according to locals. So everything was in place. the German front was up and running, and the crew began tracking down the radio stations that had been sending secret messages to the USSR. During this time, Pipe and his men would often exchange greetings with Semexco employees. A year into the operation, with many stations still up and running and very few Red Orchestra members being apprehended, a startling and coincidental discovery would be made. On the 19th of November in 1942, Semexco's offices were invaded by the Gestapo. When they entered the import-export business, they discovered only one person inside, a clerk. Gestapo, though, was able to acquire the names and addresses of employees of the company, and it was soon discovered that they were all members of the Red Orchestra. Semexco, much like Pipe's business, was also a front. It was the front for the secret organization that Pipe and the Germans had been after all along. The espionage network was right next door the entire time. Pipe had even passed by and greeted the head of it all, Leopold Trepper, a Polish communist. They'd greeted each other in the hall outside of the offices. Neither of them knew what the other was up to. Pipe and his people didn't know that the Red Orchestra was operating from Semexco, and the organization didn't know that they were running their fake business next door to the Germans who were looking for them. Virginia Lottery's Safari Quest is an online gambling game. Players must reveal a cluster of 3 symbols or more, and if they unlock the bonus wheel, they can stand a chance at winning a progressive jackpot. During each attempt, 15 symbols would be revealed. Clusters of matching symbols can be removed from the board, allowing players to win a prize from the prize chart. If 3 bonus symbols are revealed, the bonus wheel will be activated, allowing players to potentially win the jackpot. Gloucester resident Jennifer Menton showed a keen interest in the game and had been playing for quite some time, never winning anything. But in mid-October of 2023, when the jackpot reached $50,000, Jennifer found that Lady Luck was on her side. While playing Safari Quest as routine, the woman revealed 3 bonus symbols that brought her to the bonus wheel. She was the winner. Celebratory animations engulfed the screen as the $50,000 blared at the player. She was in disbelief. She didn't know it at the time, but a week later she would find herself even more perplexed. While sitting around a campfire and having a go at the same game on her mobile device, she noticed that the jackpot had reset. By this time, it was almost $1 million. She recalled thinking how lucky someone was to have just hit $1 million on that online game. Then Jennifer realized that the only reason that she could see the $912,936 jackpot on her screen was because she was the winner again. These 2 incredibly lucky wins came just 1 week apart, and it was the same woman to have won both times. The case of lightning striking twice is incredibly rare when it comes to lottery games, especially ones that are online compared to the classic method of purchasing a physical ticket. Many people have won jackpots multiple times over the years by buying lottery tickets with the same numbers, but in the case of an online cluster match game, the odds were more unlikely. According to Harvard statistics professor Dr. Mark Klickman, if a player had already won the lottery, the chance that they would win a second time would be the same probability as if they'd not previously won. This makes the week-apart winning of Jennifer Milton a very lucky coincidence. With the amazing success of The Exorcist, many films followed in its wake. One such horror film, revered as one of the scariest, was The Omen, released in June of 1976. At the helm of the film was a powerful performance by Gregory Peck, and of course there were unforgettable and traumatizing set pieces. But the terrifying characters and fear-inducing props weren't the only things haunting the film. The entire production was cursed. According to the legend of the Curse of the Omen, various tragedies and unexplainable coincidences tortured the film and its crew. The first signs of trouble during the production of the horror movie were noted when Peck's plane was flying over the London set. During the trip, the plane was struck by lightning. It was the beginning of a bad omen. Just 3 days later, while producer Mace Newfield had been flying over England on the same flight, the plane was struck by lightning again. Aircraft being struck by lightning isn't particularly unusual. In fact, it happens all the time. But even on land, it seemed that the cast and crew were not safe from the ominous incidents. Often, the crew were able to just evade a tragedy by either a day or an hour. Newfield recalled that the crew had reservations at a restaurant. This was during the time of the IRA incidents. The producer was to meet up with other members in an hour, and just as they were getting themselves ready, the restaurant was blown up. Even more shocking, while heading to the subway station that would take them to the restaurant, the station was blown up too. Lightning strikes and violent acts weren't the only tragedies running rampant during filming. During one sequence, the adoptive mother of the character, Damien, took her child out for a pleasant trip to the zoo. The scene would take place in the Windsor Wild Safari Park, where the cameraman was shooting the lions, a piece that wouldn't wind up in the final film. This was because after the crew moved to the baboon side of the zoo, one of the guards ended up being mauled by 2 lions. By now, the entire studio was aware that they were being plagued by unfortunate events and hailed the production as cursed. This, of course, allowed them to drum up a whole lot of publicity. The cursed set, though, was far from over. Lions and baboons weren't the only animals attacking. Rottweilers were being used on set to portray hellhounds, and they would allegedly turn on their trainers. One such attack saw stuntman Terry Walsh being seriously injured. It seemed that strange circumstances weren't limited to the crew or the set, but had anything to do with the movie. In 2005, during the filming of a documentary about the curse itself, the producer, Alan Tyler, claimed that 2 different camera crews in 2 different areas had experienced the same technical difficulties while filming. During the 2006 remake of The Omen, 13,500 feet worth of film were unexplainably destroyed during processing. The Glacier National Park was established in May of 1910, becoming America's 10th national park. Early newspapers boasted about its alpine scenery and several glaciers, using these features as reasons to visit the park. The glacier was soon hailed the crown of the continent and became not only a tourist destination, but a camping spot for locals. The park soon established trails, roads, and campsites along the park, attracting more visitors to revel in its beauty. Aside from steep drop-offs and large bodies of water, there were other dangers that visitors would be warned about. Since the park was a preservation ground, wildlife was plentiful. Fauna included birds, butterflies, deer, mountain goats, snakes, and wolverines and grizzly bears. As campsites became a norm in the park by the 60s, bears and other animals grew accustomed to seeking out snacks that had been left out, despite the warning by park rangers. On the 12th of August in 1967, a group of co-eds headed down to Trout Lake in the glacier. Along the way, they encountered 2 hikers who warned them that they'd just been chased by a bear. The grizzly had eventually moved on, and the hikers were left disturbed and trying to reach civilization. The crew, though, were not deterred by this information and continued their journey. They, like many young people, were in the area for just a few months during summer break, working in hotels or camps. The 5 of them had the day off and packed up some food and sleeping bags for an overnight stay by the lake. One of the 5 was 19-year-old Michelle Coons from San Diego. Despite hearing about the bear, she decided to cook up some hot dogs for dinner, which unfortunately attracted the grizzly's attention. Michelle gasped and pointed at the furry beast who was now standing in front of the camp. For a moment, the group watched in fear. The bear charged, and the 5 scattered as it ripped through the dinner before lumbering back into the wooded area. Despite this very close call, the crew decided to remain at the camp and snuggled down into their sleeping bags, but none of them could sleep. Accompanying another member, Denise Huckle, was her dog Squirt. Around 2 a.m. the following morning, while everyone lay awake, Squirt gave a growl, and Huckle could hear the bear approaching, with its paws snapping twigs and rustling leaves. The beast descended upon them, ripping at sleeping bags and sending the group running for their lives. Unfortunately, one of them, Michelle, didn't make it out, and the bear grabbed hold of her. No one had ever had their life taken by a grizzly in the glacier since its establishment, but as the sun set on the 13th of August, 2 people would have lost their lives. 4 hours before Michelle had been dragged into the woods, another camper was taken. Julie Helgeson was the same age as Michelle and was camping 10 miles away with Roy Ducat. The 2 had been asleep near the Granite Park Chalet when a different grizzly bear launched from the woods and lashed onto Julie. Initially, she was able to fight it off, but when the bear came back, it grabbed the young woman by her feet and drug her into the darkness. On the same evening, 2 different women, both the same age, had been fatally mauled by 2 different grizzlies, 10 miles apart from each other. When news flooded through the park, officials were left stunned. For all the years that the national park had been in operation, there hadn't been one bear fatality, Yet in the span of just hours, there were 2 incidents. Stephen Hawking was an English theoretical physicist. His theory on black holes made use of the theory of relativity in quantum mechanics. Hawking was no doubt one of the most well-known scientists of the modern era, but making him even more renowned was a disease that he'd been diagnosed with. At the age of 21, Hawking was diagnosed with the incurable ALS. This didn't hinder him from becoming a great scientist, though. But as the word synchronicity came into play, Hawking would find himself on a different level of notable figures, a list of strange and intriguing coincidences. It all starts on a cold January day, all the way back in 1642. It was that day that another great scientist, astronomer, and mathematician, Galileo, would take his last breath. Then, exactly 300 years later, on the 8th of January in 1942, Stephen Hawking was born and would go on to rewrite the rules of understanding the cosmos. This strange coincidence isn't the only connection that Hawking was found to have with another well-known scientist. Through further digging, it was discovered that Hawking's passing, which came on the 14th of March in 2018, just so happened to be on the birthday of Albert Einstein, which came 139 years prior. Strangely, both Einstein and Hawking lived to the age of 76, with Galileo being just 1 year older upon his passing. Interestingly, the scientist was also nicknamed Einstein while he was in school, despite his below-average marks. Hawking's passing and Einstein's birthday also happened to be the day that the mathematical constant pi is honored. This cosmic coincidence certainly got many social media users talking. Twitter users posted about this strange coincidence and proclaimed that time is circular with no beginning or end. 3 giants of modern cosmology seem to have been connected through various aspects of their lives, making this intriguing coincidence strangely symbolic. The odds of winning the lottery are about 1 billion to 1. Winning twice is 283 billion to 1, which is just nearly impossible. But these odds seem to have not applied to one couple from the UK. David Long is a retired HGV driver who, along with his wife Kathleen, decided to play the Euro Millions in 2013. Euro Millions had initiated the millionaire raffle draw on the 26th of July in 2013. The pair had almost missed out on the win because David hadn't checked his raffle code properly. He thought he'd only won £2 and tossed the ticket in the bin. At the last moment, he decided to take the ticket out with him when he went to get a newspaper and fished it out of the trash. When he arrived at the shop, he discovered it was worth a lot more. If he hadn't taken that lottery ticket from the garbage, David and Kathleen wouldn't be £1 million richer. Despite having won a whole lot of money, the Longs still maintained a modest lifestyle. They were living in their caravan, and even after they won, they remained there. Even though the odds are against us winning the lottery, David believed that this wouldn't be the last time that he hit the jackpot. He repeatedly told Kathleen that he was going to do it again one day, and David was right. He was going to win the lottery again. Some years later, in March, Euro Millions released the Mega Friday draw that would see 10 winners, driving away with not only £1 million but also a new car. They would have the choice between a Range Rover Autobiography and a Jaguar F-Type. David decided to play the lottery again, believing that he would win. On a Saturday morning, he sat there checking the raffle codes, and after a few moments, he calmly called over his wife. Kathleen read the raffle codes, checked the TV, and turned on her laptop to check the website. She put her glasses on and went right up to the TV to read the numbers a second time. A few moments elapsed, and Kathleen uttered her first words, "You said you'd do it again, and you have." David had once again won the lottery, despite the odds being against him. The lucky man's secret to success is simple. He plays when there are a lot of prizes available. He claimed to always have known that he would win, even the first time, and that he had a feeling that it would be him the second time around too. A Camelot spokesperson commented on how extraordinary the situation was, and how fortunate someone must be to win again. Kathleen and her husband decided that with the second win, a luxurious cruise was needed in celebration. Nick Castellanos is a famous baseball player. He plays as the left fielder and third baseman. With promising hitting skills, he made his MLB debut with the Detroit Tigers in 2013. He was later traded to the Chicago Cubs, and in 2022, Castellanos would become a Philadelphia Philly. Castellanos is revered as one of the best Philly hitters, which bodes well for Philadelphia as they attempt to get back to the World Series for a second year. This baseball star is known for hitting many home runs, but with so many, there's bound to be a time when he hits a home run at quite an inconvenient time. This two-time All-Star sparked off a series of coincidences back in 2020 when he hit a poorly timed home run. It was the 19th of August when the Reds broadcaster, Tom Brenneman, was issuing an on-air apology. He'd previously been caught on mic uttering a slur and subsequently resigned. During the apology, though, the baseball game was still ongoing, and Castellanos had just hit a home run. This led to awkwardness among the crowd of fans who didn't know if they should cheer or not. A year later, on the 5th of July in 2021, the Royals broadcast had been in the middle of eulogizing a World War II veteran who'd passed away just 2 days earlier at the age of 97. Again, the baseball star hit a home run, and strangely, it was in the exact same building as the first time, and went to the same part of the ballpark. Quietly interrupting the eulogy was the spokesperson whispering, "There's a drive deep left center field." On the 30th of May in 2022, Castellanos wasn't about to let Memorial Day pass without hitting a home run. This would have been notable all by itself, but again, it came at a poor time. During the home run, the Phillies broadcaster, Tom McCarthy, was memorializing fallen service members. The quote, "honoring those who paid the ultimate sacrifice," was quickly interrupted by quote, "Castellanos rips one to deep left field." The following year, on the 11th of October, the Phillies were still in search of success when another awkward moment would strike, marking the fourth coincidence of the set. It was during Game 3 of the NLDS when the baseball player hit his second home run of the evening. It came at the poorly timed moment that Brian Anderson, the TBS broadcaster, was sending his well wishes to the previous Phillies manager, Charlie Manuel, who'd recently suffered a stroke. But this time, it appeared that it was more of a poorly timed positive moment, since Manuel was on the road to recovery. The coincidental events, though, didn't stop there, and on the 18th of June in 2024, the strangeness would strike again. While the home run and unfortunate news came 1 hour apart this time, it still added to the coincidences that surrounded Castellanos. The Phillies outfielder had hit down the line an hour after the sports world announced and mourned the loss of Giants legend Willie Mays, who passed away at 93 years old. The following month, Castellanos blasted another home run, and no ill-fortuned announcements were made. It was as though the curse had been lifted, only for the United States President Donald Trump to be the victim of an attempted assassination just 2 hours later. The Phillies' home run may have preluded the assassination attempt, keeping up with the coincidental trend of poorly timed highlights involving the outfielder. On the 21st of July, that same year, just 2 hours after the then President Joe Biden announced that he'd be dropping out of the presidential race, Castellanos hit another home run. In 1953, Mr. George D. Bryson headed out on a business trip and arrived in Louisville, Kentucky. He began searching for a suitable hotel where he could stay during his visit, and landed up at the Brown Hotel. After signing the register, Bryson was handed his room key, number 307. A few days into his stay there, he headed to the front desk to see if any letters or phone calls had arrived for him. It turned out there had been a letter addressed to George D. Bryson, who was staying in room 307. This didn't appear out of place since the businessman had been staying in that very room. But upon opening the letter, it was discovered that it wasn't actually for him, but rather for the previous occupant of 307. Coincidentally, that occupant was also named George D. Bryson. Neither of the Brysons were aware of the other's existence, and they'd never met. The staff at the hotel were also baffled by this intriguing coincidence, and mistakenly delivered letters and phone calls to the current occupant during his stay that were actually intended for the other. This wasn't the only time that something like this had happened in a hotel. That same year, television reporter Irv Kupcinet was in London to cover Elizabeth II's coronation. At his hotel, while looking through the drawers in his room, he found some items that were marked as belonging to a man named Harry Hannon. Hannon was a basketball star and happened to be good friends with Kupcinet. This wasn't a coincidence, though. Just before he could call his friend and tell him of the strange find, Kupcinet had received a letter. The letter was from Hannon, and he informed the television reporter that while he was staying in a hotel in Paris called Hotel Maurice, he discovered an item in the drawer. it was a tie, and strangely enough, it had Cupsinet's name on it. Aside from aiding in eating, speaking, and appearance, false teeth have other uses. They can prevent your facial muscles from sagging, stop your jawbone from wasting away, and even deflect stray bullets. This is supposedly what happened in 2009 to a Croatian man named Ivan Lebedev. According to one source, Ivan was brushing his set of false teeth when a stray bullet entered through his open window. The man was almost the victim of an accidental assassination, but instead of taking his life, the lead became lodged in his false teeth. Oddly, this happened once again 2 years later under the same circumstances, and again, Ivan was saved from certain demise by his own set of dentures. But it turned out that this wasn't the only time that false teeth have saved the day. Just 1 year prior to Ivan's first brush with the Grim Reaper, another Croatian man found himself experiencing a similar ordeal. It happened in the capital of Zagreb, where 37-year-old Stipe Pavlovic and his wife Mima were being caught up in an argument between two men. One of the aggressors pulled a firearm and let off one round. The bullet grazed Mima's cheekbone and then lodged itself into her husband's mouth, right into his dentures. Upon being interviewed, Stipe explained that he thought it was the end for sure, and he didn't even see that it had grazed his wife. The next thing he knew, he was spitting out a chunk of hot lead. In the same year that Ivan experienced his second accidental assassination attempt, a Brazilian man had also found himself meeting his maker. 81-year-old Zacarias Pacheco de Moraes had been working in the bar that he owned in the small city of Alta Floresta when an unknown patron fired at him. The slug was headed straight for his head and would have become lodged in his brain if it wasn't for an unlikely shield: his false teeth. While the dentures had deflected the lead, it did end up still piercing the man and became stuck in his throat. Officials later commented that the item could not be removed immediately since it was too risky. Zacharias, though, remained in stable condition, with the danger of losing his eyesight until the bullet could be removed. Louis III and Charles VIII, both of whom were King of France, lost their lives 616 years apart, but in a remarkable coincidence, their deaths were eerily similar. Louis III was born around the year 863 to Louis the Stammerer, who became the King of France in 877. At the time of his birth, though, his father was ruling over Aquitaine, while his grandfather, Charles the Bald, was the King of West Francia. Louis would succeed his father as king in April of 879, but he didn't get off to the greatest start, since he was dealt with his first military loss just 1 year later, at the hands of the Vikings at a clash known as the Battle of Lüneburg. Louis was one of two brothers, and after their father passed away, they decided to divide the kingdom into two parts. Louis remained king of northern and western France, while his brother, Carloman II, was given rule over the south and east. Duke Bosso was one of Charles the Bald's most reliable lieutenants, and he was elected as King of Provence, and in 880, he and Carloman waged war against him, after which they were able to capture northern Provence. They then joined forces with their cousin, Charles the Fat, and together they laid siege on Vienna in August of that same year. The following year, the two brothers would defeat the Vikings, and Louis's previous loss against them was avenged. Keep in mind that Louis was only 16 or 17 years old at this time, but he would remain king for 3 years until 882, when he met a most unfortunate end. At the time, he was in Saint-Denis talking to a girl. She rejected his advances and ran to her father's house, but Louis wouldn't give up that easily. He jumped on a horse and gave chase, but after doing so, he hit his head on the lintel of a door, and shortly after passed away as a result. As for Charles VIII, he was crowned king in August of 1483, when he was just 13 years old, though his sister, Anne de Beaujeu, was given de facto power given his young age. But when he turned 26, he started the Italian Wars by attacking Naples. He also embraced the Renaissance, unlike many other monarchs of the time. He decided to undertake the massive task of transforming his father, Louis XI's medieval fortress, into a palace after he was inspired by the changes that the Renaissance brought about. He ordered that the first Italian-inspired garden be built in Loire Valley and was responsible for many other modern pieces of architecture that were new to France. But he didn't have much time to enjoy any of these, since he soon suffered a similar fate to that of Louis III. While at the Royal Chateau of Amboise in 1498, he decided he was in the mood for a game of tennis, and wanting her to join him, he looked for his wife, Queen Anne of Brittany. Hence, he went to her apartments to look for her, but in his haste to find her, he misjudged a low door lintel and hit his head. He shrugged the accident off and fetched the queen, and they proceeded to have their game of tennis. He seemed completely normal until he suddenly collapsed and lost consciousness. A doctor examined him but couldn't do anything to help, and later that evening he passed away in a curiously similar way to Louis III, both having been undone by a door lintel. Tamerlane, also known as Timur, was a Mongol who established and ruled over the Timurid Empire from 1370 to 1405. Born in Kesh, which is situated near modern-day Uzbekistan, he grew up as a member of the Barlas tribe. As an adult, he was appointed as the minister of Transoxiana, but he soon decided to team up with his brother-in-law instead, and together they conquered Transoxiana. But he then turned on his brother-in-law, and after his life was ended, Tamerlane declared himself to be the restorer of the Mongol Empire. From here, he fought many more battles and occupied several different territories. He emerged victorious over Lithuania forces, and after occupying Moscow and Russia, he set his sights on a disjointed Persia in 1383. 2 years later, he had conquered eastern Persia, though this resulted in entire cities being destroyed. Next, he all but destroyed Delhi in India, a setback that would take the country more than a century to come back from. He then traveled to Egypt in order to enact revenge on 2 sultans who had taken over several of his territories. He also attacked Syria, Damascus, and Baghdad. But while on his way to China in 1404, he became ill and passed away in February of 1405. He was buried in an ebony coffin, which was interred in a tomb in Samarkand. This very tomb is said to carry a curse that many people believe came true many years later, though some believe that the events that followed were mere coincidences. It all started when Joseph Stalin, the former leader of the Soviet Union, started showing an interest in Tamerlane and his tomb. He decided that he wanted the conqueror's remains brought to Moscow, and so he tasked 2 men to lead an expedition to the tomb, and in 1941 they arrived to start excavating. But many people thought this was a terrible idea, since Tamerlane's tomb had been inscribed with a curse that read, quote, "Who disturbs Tamerlane's tomb will receive a spirit of war, and such a bloody and terrible slaughter will commence that the world has not seen in all eternity." Clergymen and local residents did all they could to put a stop to the excavation, but they were unsuccessful. The tomb was opened on the 20th of June of that year, and as soon as this was done, the mausoleum filled with a strange, choking odor. Tamerlane's remains were removed and transported to Russia as planned, but this is when most people believe the curse started to come true. On the 22nd of June, Germany invaded the Soviet Union, and perhaps worried about the curse, Stalin ordered that Tamerlane's remains were to be returned to the tomb. Soon after this was done, the invading German forces were defeated. Many people believe that this series of events is the result of the tomb being opened, and that the curse is very real, but others point to the fact that the invasion had been planned months in advance, and hence believing the opening of the tomb and the invasion to be nothing more than a coincidence. Whatever the case may be, Tamerlane's tomb has remained sealed since then, possibly out of fear that the curse may strike again. Sacagawea was a Native American woman who grew up as a member of the Shoshone tribe. She was born in either 1788 or 89 and spent her childhood in the Salmon River region of the Rocky Mountains in what is modern-day Idaho. She was known to be very good at gathering food, using sharpened sticks to dig up turnips, artichokes, and wild licorice. For a long time, it was thought that her name meant Bird Woman, but this has since been rectified by the Shoshone, who revealed that it actually means boat pusher. In 1800, she was abducted by a rival tribe, the Hidatsa, while they were in the midst of a buffalo hunt. She was taken to a settlement near modern-day North Dakota, and in either 1803 or 04, she was traded to Toussaint Charbonneau, a French fur trader, either as a payment of a gambling debt or an outright purchase. Charbonneau took Sacagawea as his second wife, something that would usually have been frowned upon. But since he'd lived amongst Native American tribes for years, he had adopted many of their traditions, one of which was polygamy. During this time, the US President Thomas Jefferson was looking for the Northwest Passage after completing the Louisiana Purchase, a deal that cost $15 million and saw the US nearly double its size since it now owned 828,000 square miles of land west of the Mississippi River. At the time, the Northwest Passage was just a rumor. It suggested that there was a passage between the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans, and that when it was found, it would provide a superior trade route. Jefferson charged Meriwether Lewis as head of the expedition, which was called the Corps of Discovery. Lewis, in turn, appointed William Clark as his co-captain, and today the endeavor is known as the Lewis and Clark Expedition. But they were told to also explore these newly acquired lands, surveying the landscape and learning all they could about the people who lived there. They were told to draw maps as they traveled and bring back natural specimens that they encountered during the long journey. In November of 1804, the expedition came across the Hidatsa tribe that had abducted Sacagawea, and upon realizing that her husband spoke French, they decided that she would be a great asset, since she could translate French to Shoshone. The expedition knew that the Shoshone tribe had horses, and was interested in purchasing a few since they needed to transport supplies over the Bitterroot Mountains. They'd been unable to communicate with them up to this point, but this problem would be solved if they had Sacagawea in their company. They hadn't needed horses until arriving at the Hidatsa's territory, since they'd been traveling by boat, but they needed to wait a while since Sacagawea was pregnant. She gave birth 3 months later, after which she and Charbonneau accompanied Lewis and Clark on their journey. They eventually reached Lemmy Pass in the Bitterroot Mountain Range, and 5 days later they ran into a few members of the Shoshone tribe. Sacagawea told them that the expedition wanted to buy a few horses, and what followed is considered by many to be an unbelievable coincidence. They accompanied the 3 men that they had encountered to the tribe's land, where they were introduced to their chief, a man named Kumiawait. While negotiations were underway, Kumiawait got a closer look at the chief and was amazed to realize that she was talking to her brother, who she had not seen for years. They had a happy reunion while marveling at the coincidence that had reunited them. Sacagawea would go on to be instrumental to the rest of the expedition, and today is one of the most memorialized women in all of the United States. Most of us are familiar with Steve Jobs, the co-founder and former CEO of Apple, who sadly passed away on the 5th of October 2011. He was born in 1955, but was adopted shortly after his birth when his Syrian father and American mother decided to put him up for adoption. But his adoption came with the condition that he was to be taken in by 2 college-educated people, since they wanted him to have the best possible chance at making his life a success. His adoptive parents, Clara and Paul Jobs, never went to college, but they promised that they would provide him with a college education once he graduated from high school. While in college, he met Steve Wozniak, with whom he would go on to found Apple Inc. Once he graduated, he did indeed go to college, but decided to drop out, and instead he started auditing classes. During this time, he slept on friends' couches and dorm room floors and collected Coca-Cola bottles, returning them for money to get by. He also managed to get some free meals from a local temple. While Jobs and Wozniak may have been friends and colleagues, Jobs wasn't exactly honest. The pair had at one stage developed a game for the Atari gaming system called Breakout, and they agreed to split the profits made 50-50. But when they were finally paid for the game, Jobs received $5,000, $350 of which he gave to Wozniak, while keeping the remaining $4,650 for himself. When they decided to start Apple Inc., Jobs and Wozniak had another partner, a man called Ronald Wayne. But just 2 weeks into their partnership, Wayne decided he wanted out and sold his 10% share of the company for a mere $800. The company would of course go on to be hugely successful, but in 1985, Jobs was forced out and he started the animation studio Pixar. He would return to Apple 12 years later and helped refresh the company. He came under fire at one point for disbanding the company's philanthropic program, but promised that it would be brought back when profits were up, but this never happened. Strangely, Jobs never really liked PCs and never learned to code, despite being the founder of one of the largest tech companies in the world. In 2003, he was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer, but he refused medical treatment and instead opted for alternative treatments, such as acupuncture and visiting psychics, though he eventually opted to have surgery. After his passing, Jerry Brown, the then governor of California, declared that the 16th of October was Steve Jobs Day. Not many people know that he's also the subject of a strange coincidence between him and his biological father. After his adoptive mother passed away in 1986, he started looking for his biological parents and managed to track his mother and sister down. He would later be very surprised to learn that his biological father was the owner of a Syrian restaurant that he used to frequent very often, and that they'd actually met before but were completely unaware that they were related. His father learned of their connection in 2006, but decided not to contact Jobs for fear that he would think he wanted a part of his fortune. He described Jobs as a sweet guy who would always leave a substantial tip, but he never got the chance to know him as Jobs passed away, having only ever shaken his father's hand. At present, 45 men have served as the President of the United States, with only 2, Franklin D. Roosevelt and Donald Trump, holding that position on more than one occasion. President-elect Trump is set to be inaugurated as the 47th president in January of 2025. While each of these presidents may have had very different visions for the country and went about them in very different ways, it's now been revealed that they all have one thing in common, bar one. The discovery was made in 2012 when a 12-year-old girl from Salinas in California decided to trace her family's French roots. But while in the process of doing this, she decided to study the bloodlines of the American presidents. She recruited her grandfather in her quest since he had decades of experience in genealogy. They started right at the beginning with the first US president, George Washington. They traced both male and female bloodlines and were surprised to find that he had an unexpected ancestor, King John of England, who's known for signing the Magna Carta. This discovery had never been made by any other genealogists since they'd only used male bloodlines to trace presidents' ancestry and only linked 22 presidents to their roots. Furthermore, she discovered that all of the US presidents were related to King John, with the only exception being the 8th president of Martin Van Buren, whose roots have been traced back to the Netherlands. When she learned that she and Barack Obama were related, she wrote a letter addressed to him, informing him of their connection, and sent it to the White House, but only received a generic response. She then created a poster detailing her findings and started selling signed copies in an effort to raise money for a trip to Washington, D.C., where she hoped to hand one of the posters over to the president, but it isn't known whether she ever got the chance to do so. This discovery led to another strange revelation, that every president except for Donald Trump is descended from families that owned slaves at some point, a fact that took many people by surprise. King John was also known as John Lackland, a nickname given to him by his father, Henry II, who believed he would never inherit any substantial piece of land. He was the brother of Richard the Lionheart, but the two brothers had a strained relationship, evidenced by the fact that when Richard was taken prisoner after the Third Crusade, John actually asked his brother's captors to keep him imprisoned for as long as possible. He eventually passed away in 1216, and almost immediately, rumors started to swirl that he had lost his life after his fruit or ale was poisoned. But these theories have been dismissed, as it's now believed he actually passed away from dysentery. It isn't known whether any of the findings were ever seen by any of the presidents, but most people find it remarkable that a 7th grader was able to do what experienced genealogists failed to do for decades. Nero ruled from the year 54 to 68, but his time in power was riddled with controversy. For the first 5 years of his reign, he was praised for his acts of kindness and generosity. He reduced taxes, outlawed capital punishment, and even pardoned traitors who'd plotted against him. But this all soon changed. He started using his position as a means to fulfill his own desires. He commissioned that his mother be assassinated, married his stepsister before divorcing her shortly after and then banishing her, and then also ordered that her life was to be ended. He also ended the life of his second wife. When the Great Fire of Rome broke out in 64 AD, he was seen watching the fire from afar, singing about the decimation of Troy. He also indulged in ridiculous habits such as never wearing the same clothes twice. and by this time, he was considered by those around him as spoiled, petulant, and attention-seeking. In fact, he was so self-obsessed that he was about to end his own life due to being brandished as a public enemy, and he was seen pacing back and forth repeating the phrase, "What an artist the world is losing." Not many people would link Nero to the famous former French emperor, Napoleon Bonaparte. But an interesting coincidence occurred during Napoleon's coronation that many people find almost impossible to believe. In 1804, Napoleon decided that he would be the next French emperor, and he started making arrangements for his coronation, which was no doubt a massive event. He hired a French ballooner named André Garnerin to build a massive unmanned balloon that would be released at his crowning. But this was no mere balloon. Napoleon ordered that it be decorated like a crown, using lights and other types of decoration. Garnerin did as he was told, but he would have no idea that this commission would spell the end of his association with Napoleon, all thanks to an unfortunate coincidence. On the day of the coronation, the balloon was completed and ready for launch. When the time came, it was released, much to the delight of the gathered crowd and the newly crowned emperor. The balloon soared up and out of sight, and most people likely would have put it out of their minds almost immediately. But they could not have expected what happened next. Unbeknownst to anyone in France, the balloon had drifted all the way to Italy, specifically Rome. Here it finally descended and came to rest in Lake Bracciano, but before doing so, it managed to snag onto Nero's tomb. This resulted in the crown decorations falling off and coming to a rest on the tomb. When Napoleon found out about this, he was furious since he didn't want to be associated with Nero, who was seen as one of the worst emperors in all of history. He saw it as a bad omen, and for some reason decided that Garnerin was responsible. He fired the ballooner and refused to use balloons in his military campaigns from that day on. While many people at the time realized that this was merely a coincidence, others agreed that it was some type of sign that bad times were ahead. It's believed that Napoleon made this decision because he was at the height of his megalomania and wouldn't use balloons out of fear of being overthrown. The famous musician Elton John attributes much of his success to his longtime friend and songwriter Bernie Taupin, with whom he's been creating music for more than 50 years. While they're both very talented in their own right, they may never have reached the heights they have if it wasn't for an incredible coincidence that led to the pair meeting for the first time. Taupin was born in Lincolnshire, England in 1950. The first few years of his life were spent growing up on a farm that had no electricity. But when his father landed a job as a farm manager, the family relocated to Rowston Manor, where they lived rent-free and with electricity. Taupin was said to not have been the best student at school, but showed a penchant for writing from an early age. He decided to leave school when he was 15 years old, after which he started working for a local newspaper outlet since he wanted to become a journalist. This position didn't last long though, as he decided it was more fun to spend time with his friends and to hitchhike to dance clubs in the surrounding areas. But he did work a few part-time jobs, but could never have foreseen the path his life would take shortly after turning 17. As for Elton John, he was born in Middlesex in 1947 and was considered a child prodigy at playing the piano. When he was just 11 years old, he gained a scholarship to the Royal Academy of Music. He'd fallen in love with pop music after becoming familiar with the rhythm and blues genre. He became the organ player for a band called Bluesology, which would later serve as John Baldry's backing band. Then, in 1967, Liberty Records placed an ad in NME, an abbreviation for New Musical Express, which is a British media company that covers subjects like music and culture. The record label was on the hunt for new talent and called for anyone with talent to contact them. John saw the ad and decided to respond by traveling to the company's office in London, where he met Ray Williams, the label's artist and repertoire representative. He was asked to play a few songs on the piano, but ultimately didn't impress since his lyric writing abilities were subpar. Williams realized that he'd received several poems from someone who'd answered the same ad, and thinking that John might find them useful, handed the poems to him. While traveling home by train, John read the poems and was very impressed. Quite unbelievably, they had been written by Taupin, who'd read the same ad and responded in hopes that his writing could help him break into the music industry, and thus started a partnership that lasted decades. They soon found that the best way to write songs together was for Topin to write a set of lyrics, after which John would put music to them. He would then play the songs to Topin for creative feedback, and this formula remained the same for all the years that they've been working together. The only thing that has changed over the years is that Topin now sends lyrics to John via email, since they live in different countries, where he used to deliver them by hand in the past. The pair continues to make music together to this day, but it is strange to think that we may have never heard some of John's famous songs if it weren't for the fact that they both answered the same ad all those years ago. The name J.R.R. Tolkien is known to most people these days, as he's remembered as the author of the series of books The Lord of the Rings, which resulted in what many consider to be the best trilogy of fantasy movies ever created. He's one of the most widely read authors of all time, thanks to the epic tales that he created, and will forever be considered one of the best fantasy novelists. But not everyone knows that Tolkien was born in South Africa in 1892. His father worked for a British bank at the time but passed away while Tolkien, his brother and mother, were visiting family in England, and they never returned. His mother passed away in 1904, and Tolkien was taken in by a foster family when he was 12. He's attributed his love for languages to his mother, who introduced him to the basics of Latin while he was still young. He invented his first language, called Nevbosh, when he was still in school, after finding out his cousins had created their own language using animal names, which was called Animalic. But Tolkien's language was far more complicated and sophisticated, a skill that would stand him in good stead later in his life. He met his wife Edith when he was 16 years old. She was 3 years his senior, resulting in his guardian, Father Francis Morgan, disapproving of the relationship and urging Tolkien to rather concentrate on his studies. This had no effect on the couple, and eventually Morgan forbade the couple from seeing each other until Tolkien turned 18. They didn't see each other for the next few years, but as soon as he was able to, he married her. He was then drafted into the First World War, during which he saw a lot of combat in the trenches. He eventually contracted trench fever and was sent back to England, but most of his friends had not survived. He got the idea to write the Silmarillion, thanks to his love for the fictional languages that he had created. Then, while grading a paper one day, he wrote the line, "In a hole in the ground there lived a hobbit," which is the first line of that famous novel. This led to him writing The Lord of the Rings, which was met with mixed reviews at first but won the International Fantasy Award in 1957. But it was only in 1965 that the books became very popular, and they were revised and reprinted in a paperback version. Tolkien passed away on the 2nd of September, 1973, due to complications brought about by a stomach ulcer. This date is considered by many of his fans to be very coincidental with a certain part of Lord of the Rings. In the book, 20 rings of power are created, and 3 are given to the elves, 7 to the dwarves, 9 to the race of men, and 1 is created to rule them all. These numbers, when put together and reversed, result in 1973, the year that the author passed away. While this coincidence obviously has no real meaning, many of Tolkien's fans think this is bittersweet that these numbers somehow aligned, as if dreamed up by the fantasy author himself. When you hear the name Isaac Newton, you're likely reminded of the tale in which he's said to have been sitting under an apple tree when one of the apples dislodged from a branch and hit him on the head. The story goes that this led to him discovering the law of universal gravitation, but in reality this never happened. While Newton did discover the law of universal gravitation, it was due to his observing of an apple falling from a tree, and in reality it never fell on his head. It merely caused him to start wondering about gravity, which then led to his discovery. While this may be what Newton is mostly remembered for, he played a major role in other scientific discoveries, such as the 3 laws of motion, the reflecting telescope, and maybe most importantly, calculus. But not many people know that his invention of calculus is the subject of an uncanny coincidence that took place in the 1600s. Newton had collaborated with another scientist, Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, while working on other mathematical problems. But following this, they went their separate ways. Years later, it would come to light that both men had started working on a different type of mathematics, and in an unbelievable coincidence, had both invented calculus at the same time, which comes as a surprise to many people who were taught that it was invented by Newton alone. This resulted in a war between the two men, as they each claimed to have invented it before the other. Newton wrote a series of papers on the subject, but for reasons unknown refused to publish them. It's believed he wrote the first papers in 1669, since many of his friends claimed to have read it at that time, though this has never been fully proven. Leibniz claimed he devised calculus in the 1670s, but only published his first paper on the subject in the 1680s, which is why Newton is usually credited with its invention. Newton accused Leibniz of reading his manuscripts and claimed that he got the idea for the invention of calculus from his work, but Leibniz reminded him that he published his work first, and hence believed that Newton had stolen the idea from him instead. This resulted in a committee being formed by the Royal Society to ascertain who the real inventor was. Both Newton and Leibniz were told to submit accounts of their findings and what they had learned from the other's work. It was then discovered that Newton had written a letter to Leibniz in which he described the idea of calculus, and a few years later, Leibniz published his first paper. The result of the inquiry was that Newton was the inventor of calculus, but it should be noted that the head of that committee was none other than Newton himself. The results of the inquiry were sent to Leibniz in 1713, and he had no choice but to accept this judgment, despite still claiming that he was the real inventor of calculus. Unfortunately, he had no foot to stand on, and as other scientists sided with Newton, there was nothing further to be done about the matter. When talking about coincidences, one name is sure to crop up, that of Violet Jessop, a woman who survived not one, but 3 maritime disasters. Violet started work on the RMS Olympic, the flagship of the White Star Line Company, in 1911. But while aboard, the ship collided with the HMS Hawke while sailing on the Solent Strait. Then it had to be brought back to Belfast after nearly sinking. Then in 1912, she was offered a position on the HMS Titanic, and she eagerly accepted. The Titanic famously hit an iceberg on the 14th of April of that year and sank beneath the icy waters of the North Atlantic Ocean. She made it into one of the few lifeboats and miraculously survived once again. World War II broke out 2 years later, and Violet was assigned to the HMS Britannic, a hospital ship. On the 16th of November of that year, the ship struck a mine in the water and sank, but Violet, who had to abandon a lifeboat, was pulled from the water and rescued, making that the 3rd disaster that she survived. But she isn't the only person to have survived multiple shipwrecks. A man named Arthur John Priest is considered very lucky, as he was on board 5 different ships when they sank, but survived each time, which is considered to be an unbelievable set of coincidences. Priest was born in Southampton, England in 1877, and since he was one of 12 children, he had a poor upbringing. At age 25, he found a job as a coal stoker aboard a steamship. He considered himself lucky to have found a job during those difficult times, and even luckier when he landed the same job on the RMS Olympic. Quite unbelievably, he was aboard the same ship when Violet was aboard, and they both managed to survive its collision with the HMS Hawke, while many others lost their lives. But this was the second time that he'd experienced a ship colliding with another. On that occasion, he was working on the Asturias ship when it collided with another ship during its maiden voyage, but in that incident, no one was injured. Most people would look for other work after having 2 such close calls, but Priest was offered work on the Titanic, and he readily accepted since he would receive a lot more pay. He was forced to jump into the icy water after climbing his way onto the ship's deck, and there he was picked up by a lifeboat. When the war broke out, he served aboard the battleship Alcantara, but one day he heard a loud bang and the ship started shaking violently. He would learn that it had encountered a German ship called Grief, which was disguised as an Allied ship, and when it got within range, had fired on the Alcantara. The battle ensued, during which both ships were destroyed, and once again he was rescued from the water after being forced to abandon ship. Later that year, he started work on the Britannic, the same ship that Violet was working on when it hit a sea mine, and once again he made it out alive. The following year, he started work on another hospital ship, the Donegal. While crossing the English Channel, the ship was attacked by a German U-boat and sank, ending the lives of 40 people. But Priest managed to survive once again. He retired after that last incident and was given the nickname the Unsinkable Stoker. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you liked this video, be sure to hit that like button. Also, don't forget to subscribe and click that notification bell to keep up to date with all of our future uploads. But my name is Ty Knotts, and I'll catch you guys in the next video.